January of 2005. I found it interesting that he began working in land and water conservation in '93, and he listed the sites as Montana and northern Japan. Do you speak Japanese?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, wow. 2 years ago, he was appointed as commissioner to the Oregon Water Resources Commission. He said he's not an attorney and cannot give legal advice, and as he's gotten more mature, he's realized that he probably shouldn't offer an opinion on anything.
That's right.
Been there, done that. He has spoken to our club before about nitty fish, clean water, and the work at the McKenzie River Trust. Today, he will speak more generally about some of the issues we face locally and regionally in Western Oregon, where we have a dependable supply of excellent water, for now. So Joe, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate that.
My pleasure, Glenn. Thanks for the invitation. If I speak like this, can everyone hear me okay?
Good.
Great. Before I begin, I don't know the gentleman's name, but his title says Susan Fanner. He's out of the view right now. It looked like he had something to share. He had raised his hand. Yeah.
Coming back. John Joe is asking if you had something to share.
I saw you raise your hand before, and I didn't want to get started if you still had a piece of business to attend to. Okay.
He's muted, so.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Well, thanks, everyone. I know Zoom is just a crazy, awkward thing that we've all gotten used to at some level. So let's make the best of it. I think one of the best ways to make the best of Zoom is to not just what we call a verbal carpet, just keep talking and talking. So there's a few things I'd like to just relay, convey some stories, a few updates on things that I think might be interesting to you locally and regionally, and then open it up to questions and back and forth. If you have questions for each other, for me, I welcome that. As Glenn said, I've been with the Trust for over 15 years. One of your members, I can't see her now because there's too many people, but Linda Carnine, you may or may not know, is a member of our board of directors. So that technically makes her one of 15 of my bosses. Thank you, Linda, for being here and all you do to support the Trust. I've got a few things over the course of this 10 minutes or so that I'll just put into the chat box that you can go to at your leisure if you'd like. So the first one is just our website. The McKenzie River Trust has been around based in Eugene since 1989. We're what's called a land trust, which means our primary toolkit is real estate transactions and land management on behalf of public values: clean water, fish and wildlife habitat, viewshed, recreation. I know several of you participate and support the Trust, so thank you. But if you'd like some more, I'm not going to get deeply into the Trust's work today, but there's our website there in the chat box. And then Glenn, feel free to share my email with any and all of your members if there are people who'd like to follow up directly.
Okay.
The second thing I'll put in the chat box is the Oregon Water Resource Commission webpage, because my guess is not everyone knows that there is such a thing and what it is. What that means is the Oregon Water Resources Department controls the amount of water that people get, whether you're an irrigator or a city working with UWEB, a private landowner who has a well. Anything that's associated with water rights in Oregon goes through the Oregon Department of Water Resources. So as a commissioner, it means I'm a volunteer. I was appointed by the governor, one of 8 positions. I think there are 6 of us on the commission now. The agency does the work, but as a Oregon public agency, some of the work is referred to the commission to ensure that it's, again, representing the people. So my expertise is not water rights. My expertise, if anything, was lost long ago, but I come out of a habitat land management world. Specifically, I did work with grizzly bears in Montana and their counterpart in northern Japan. There's a brown bear on the island of Hokkaido. So I've spent almost 30 years now in that how do people in nature, and specifically people in wildlife and now people in water, get along? How do we make the most of it and get along and support each other? So those are two things. The next thing I'm going to post there, I'm sure will, just because of the reference, lead to some prickles, and I'm not going to get into politics much, but it's going to be small p politics, because there was a piece written in the New York Times a few days ago by a conservative political scientist at George Washington University. And it has to do with this idea called fusionism in political science. And it's the recognition that when we're dealing with public goods, there's this tension between morality, how we restrain ourselves on behalf of the whole and behalf of the public and each other, versus our political freedom or our liberty to do what we want because that's our right to do so. I highly recommend this. Even though the president's name is in the title, set that aside. What's really interesting is how it made me think about, yeah, this is what we're dealing with when we're dealing with decisions around water. And we're extremely, extremely fortunate in our region to have great water. Most of us get water directly from the McKenzie River. It's our only source of water. So some of you may know that UWeb over the last 5 to 8 years has been drilling some wells at regional schools so that if that water system ever went offline, say because of a massive earthquake, we could have emergency water from some of these wells. And UWeb and the Springfield Utility Board are also considering building a new water plant on the Willamette River, just downstream from Mount Pisgah, where the Coast Fork and the Middle Fork rivers come together. But that whole question of, man, we've got great water now, begs the question of, a lot of people are going to be attracted to that and will be moving here, as I did 15 years ago. And the question is, how do we welcome them? And how do we maintain this great public resource that we have? So this tension between, hey, it's my right to water, versus, well, wait a minute, how do I restrain what I want so that everyone, all the people long after we've gone, can enjoy the water resources that we have? And it obviously, this obtains to all sorts of public resource and assets and things that we're deeply immersed in right now. So couple of things there. And I swear I only have 3 more things to post. The other piece that I'll post is a reference to a book and a writer who we at the McKenzie River Trust had the pleasure of working with about a month ago. Her name's Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she wrote a book that some of you may be familiar with called Braiding Sweetgrass. Robin was one of my professors in 1984 back in Kentucky, where I'm from. She is a PhD in plant botany, specializes in mosses. She's also a member of the Potawatomi tribe of Indians in, I think she's in New York now. I think their reservation lands are further to the Midwest. But she writes beautifully about this same question of, what do I do? And how does what I do impact the larger world, our people I live with? In her case, writing from a scientist and a Native American perspective about, in what we had her talk with us about was water. And she describes this question, the same issue, in terms of reciprocity. More simply, she says, when you go to a river, or when you use the water from a river, or anything from the natural world, how do you be a good guest? How do you, if I went to Glenn's house for dinner and I behaved horribly, we know that. We know what that means, and Glenn wouldn't invite me back. But what's it mean when you think of a river that you're getting things from? How do we behave towards that? How do we have reciprocity? And so these are the range of things that we at the McKenzie River Trust and partner organizations like watershed councils and others are exploring. So that just gives you some of the mindset that I'm bringing to this discussion today. So with that, I just want to cover 3 general things. 2 are very local. And then one is, actually 3 are very local, and then we'll add a 4th that's more statewide. The first is some things you may be seeing and reading about if you either drive up the McKenzie River toward Bend, or you are familiar with the area just below Cougar Dam on the South Fork of the McKenzie River, or Deer Creek. Those of us that have worked with rivers and natural systems, we start to look at things like, man, salmon aren't doing so good, right? So a number of things contribute to it. There's no question that having dams in the headwaters of our rivers limits where those salmon can go and spawn, limits a number of things. So those of us doing this work are trying to make the most of what's downstream. So starting in about 2 weeks, if you drive up towards Bend, off the side of the road, just before you get to the town of Blue River, just before you get to the McKenzie School part, you're going to start to see logs pile up. And you may know that that's land that we own, and it's an area where salmon spawn, and it's just a beautiful area. It's something the McKenzie River Trust acquired in 2016. Well, those logs, and I'm talking hundreds and hundreds, we hope to get maybe 1,000 or more really big tree logs. They're going to get put back into the floodplain. And the idea is, when we look at the river now, especially this time of year, if you're on any river, it's gentle and it's meandering and it's really refreshing. But if we had been here 200 years ago, even 150 years ago, and that river was just chock full of trees, and it was moving over here, and it spread out this way, and one year it went that way, and the other time it went that way. As we've narrowed and simplified those rivers, that also has an impact on things like salmon. It does have an impact on the quality of the water as well, because natural rivers, when they're able to connect seasonally with their floodplains and move back and forth, that's the system that they have for cleaning. So when we hear now talk about infrastructure, need for upgrading our roads, and people talk about green infrastructure, that's what green infrastructure is for a river. The more that we can add more of that complexity, the better the health of that river will be. So you'll see more of that, and that's one of the things that if you're interested in, just reach out to me, or there will be links from our website. It's pretty exciting, but it's really going to be shocking, because you're going to see what looks like a construction zone over the next year or two before the river is able to come back in and spread out. The next thing, also local, is you may or may not be tracking that over the last 8 months, Lane County has been going through updates to what's called its floodplain and floodway code. And the code is just the rules that come down from our state planning goals that, in this case, say, what can you do in a floodplain and what can you do in a floodway? Usually regarding building or road building or houses and that sort of thing. So back to that same idea that we've really simplified things. If you think back to, when was that? 2005 for Hurricane Katrina? I think it's been that long. If you remember any of those images, there are 2 things. One, lots of levees, and so the water's just rushing through. And those levees were built to get water out of the way. But then what happened was, when they collapsed and broke, you saw really powerful water carrying houses away. And then you also saw water that just flooded everything. Wasn't necessarily moving, but people had houses up to their roofs. I would bet that some of you were here in 1964, when we had, not that bad a disaster, but we had a massive flood. Even 96, you probably remember, if you were here then, portions of houses and vehicles and things going down this main part of the river, the floodway, and then other places just being inundated, the floodplain. Well, the reality is, where we live now, many of us in the city, we're living in that floodplain. The dams upriver do prevent a lot of floods that we might otherwise see, but not always, and they won't. We'll continue to have some big ones. So Lane County is now looking at, okay, with the health of our water in mind, what can we do to go back to that original question? Respect the rights of a landowner or an individual or a group to do something on their land. At the same time, we're thinking of the public and the public good, both from a health and from a safety perspective in a flood zone, from a water quality and provision perspective. So it's this really interesting, as Samuel Goldman writes, it's a dynamic tension. Like, wow, man, I'd love nothing more than to be able to walk out to the river every night from my home. But I also know that if I build a home right on the river, that affects my downstream neighbor. So it's a really interesting time. They just had yesterday the second hearing on proposed changes to some of these code provisions that would limit what people could or couldn't do in the floodplain and in the floodway. The next meeting is October 6th, and that's another opportunity for public hearing. It's just a great way to engage in something that it's hard to think about this time of year, because again, the river is just so predictable and so gentle and cooling and wonderful. And we just forget that 5 months from now, it could be totally raging. So really encourage you to look into that. And did I? No, I didn't. Here, let me paste. I will paste the link to Lane County's Commissioner's agenda, which has some of that background information. And it'll be the same website where they will update for the next meeting. Then from the third is a much larger regional thing that's going on now. It's called the Willamette Basin Water Reallocation. So there are, I think, 13 major dams in the whole Willamette Basin, from our headwaters all the way down to those in Portland. And again, those were put in beginning in the 1950s to reduce flood risk, to impound water, to allow it to be used for agriculture in the summer, and increasingly to provide water for both industrial and urban uses. Over time, there's been the recognition that, hey, if we use up all of the water, the river itself suffers, certainly salmon. So right now, the Corps of Engineers is working with a large group, has been for quite a while now, to say, all right, going forward, the rights associated with that water needs to be split between agriculture, urban needs, and the river itself. And so there's negotiation back and forth, because it's limited as it is. And we know that things are changing. And 20 years from now, the amount of water available, the amount of seasonal drought that we have, how floods, all that could affect what's available. And so we go right back to that same question of, man, I know I need my water for this, but how do I deal with the fact that people downstream immediately now and downstream in time are going to need water as well? And then that growing awareness that, man, to have a really healthy community, having clean water means keeping water in the river and having this river dynamism. So that one I don't have a link to, but the next thing I mentioned will allow you to back into it. But it's going to, I think, there will be more and more. If you follow especially agricultural news, irrigators in the Willamette Basin are very concerned, because they see a couple of things happening. More and more people moving to the basin means that there's more and more pressure on agricultural land to get developed. That makes it difficult to get things, and they just want to be able to ensure that they have opportunities to change crops and things as the market does. So they're following it pretty closely. In big picture, for the whole state of Oregon, the last thing I'll post is something called the Oregon's 100-year water vision. And this was announced by the governor now a year and a half ago, I think. And it is big. 100 years is a long time. And it's just a recognition that, man, when we look at where our water comes from, we have dams that were built, again, some more than 100 years ago, some private dams. I think there are about 900 private dams in Oregon, as well as the big Corps of Engineer dams. Corps of Engineer dams on an ongoing basis gets a lot of upkeep, so their safety is one thing, and we have very little to be concerned about there. Some of those older private dams, though, they haven't had the money for the upkeep, and over time, people have started to move downstream from them. It says I'm breaking up. Is everyone else experiencing that?
It did for a while, but it's okay now, Joe.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Usually that's a sign Zoom tells you that you've just been speaking too long, so I'll cut it off here pretty quick. And so we have likely changes in the water that we receive, changes in snowpack, changes in rain, changes in season. We have more people moving to Oregon. We have water infrastructure that's collapsing in some places. And even in some places you wouldn't think, like the Oregon coast. You think of the Oregon coast as just being socked in wet. This time of year, the small cities on the Oregon coast are really hurting for water because things dry up and more people are going to the coast and the infrastructure just can't handle it. So the 100-year water vision has been the state's attempt to gather everyone's thoughts on what are those water issues and how, as we talk about infrastructure, green infrastructure, as well as concrete, gray infrastructure, how do you fit all this together? They started very high level, started to do some more working groups, and then COVID hit, which both made it difficult to meet and also has really hampered state agency budgets. So it's kind of in a quiet stage right now. But over time, our groups, agencies, municipalities, it's really going to be important that we participate in these activities because it really is going to affect our quality of life. And again, I've got kids almost now all the way through South too, and I recognize that it's going to affect their quality of life and their kids' quality of life. And thinking 100 years is a difficult thing, but important to do. So those were the basic things I wanted to cover. Again, from local to regional to statewide, there's a lot going on with water. There's a lot going on everywhere. And I guess I would just then stop and see what kind of things people are interested in hearing a little more about or other references I can offer. Thanks.
Are there questions for Joe? You raise your hand. Linda? Go ahead, Linda. You
Okay.
take
Yeah, I just think I always learn a lot when Joe talks, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about what to expect with this restoration on the McKenzie River, just because it is a really complicated one. You talked about the logs being there, but I just wonder if you could share a little bit more, because that's going to be one that really, well, a lot of people see and affect them, and the more they know about it, I think it'll help their understanding.
Thanks, Linda. So when I say that a river system has been simplified, we have aerial photographs from the 1930s all the way through, and flying over that section of the McKenzie, let's even back up. In the 1850s, when people first started mapping this area, not with cameras, but with good notes and if you look at the maps, where we live in the Eugene Springfield area was this massive floodplain that had water in all sorts of places, shifting all over the place. And again, it was filled with trees that had come down and all that water does when it tumbles all of that stuff up. We spent a century plus taking that out of the river, narrowing the channels, putting roads on their sides, and just making it more like New Orleans. Not exactly, but essentially we've lost. When I was really little, one of my first memories in school was learning about the Nile River. And you have this image of the Nile, and when it comes up in whatever season it rises, when the snow melts, I guess, it goes from this what we think of as a river to this massive wetland connected all of these channels. We obviously can't do that everywhere, but a place like Finn Rock, where we're going to do this, is an opportunity because it's pretty wide. And the river goes kind of to the south there, and then there's about half a mile of floodplain that has been simplified and built up that we're going to scrape up and bring a lot more trees in and let the river come back in. So the amount of water is going to be the same, but it's going to be spread out over a much larger area. So when I'm watering my garden, if I'm not careful and I just let the hose go, it starts digging really bad, right? If I'm careful and spread it out, you have a lot of water spreading out and you don't see the erosion, you don't see all that. In order to do this at the scale of a river, we're going to be using heavy equipment, dump trucks and big cranes and all sorts of things. So for months next summer, you're going to see right along Highway 126 or on the way to Bend, all of this activity. Like, what are they doing? Are they building a hotel or something? It's really going to look like that. But then when the river comes back in, when the water is let back in after it's been temporarily pushed away, instead of there being a narrow channel, you're going to see a much wider area close to the road. The main stem will still be out of the way and people in boats will be able to get by, but it's going to look very different, very, very different.
John, you had your hand up. Did you have a question, John? John, did you have a question for Joe? You're muted there. You have to turn your.
No, I did not have a question. I'm sorry. I do want to, when we're over, get a thought for the day for tomorrow or next week.
Oh, yes, thank you. We have somebody volunteer for a thought for next week and a greeter.